All right, good afternoon. Let's begin here. Residents of the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, woke up shortly after 5 this morning to the sound of explosions. The government says cruise and ballistic missiles hit an airfield and military headquarters, prompting Ukraine to close its airspace. Now, soon after, there were reports of explosions from across the country, including the eastern city of KYIV and the town of Kramatorsk. Now, Ukraine said fierce fighting was underway at numerous locations along its Russian border. Russia's invasion of Ukraine by land, air and sea is the biggest attack by one state against another in Europe since World War II. Now, at the same time, NATO has put more than 100 warplanes on alert and will reinforce troops on its eastern flank. Now, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says the alliance has no plans to deploy troops to Ukraine. Now, Lithuania's president declared a state of emergency and set its army to its borders as military forces masked in Russia and Belarus. Now, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says weapons will be issued to any citizens ready to defend the country. Now, several European countries have called for tough sanctions against Russia and also indicated their willingness to house Ukrainian refugees that are currently fleeing their country.
Well, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has urged Russian President Vladimir Putin to recall his troops. Guterres says Putin needs to put a stop to what could be the worst war since the beginning of the century.
This is the saddest moment in my tenure as Secretary General of the United Nations. I started this meeting of the Security Council addressing President Putin and telling him from the bottom of my heart, stop your troops from an offensive to Ukraine, give peace a chance, because too many people have already died. During the meeting, President Putin announced a special military operation in the Donbass and required the Ukrainian troops to lay down their arms. So in the present circumstances, I must change my appeal. And I must say, President Putin, in the name of humanity, bring your troops back to Russia. In the name of humanity, do not allow to start in Europe what could be the worst war since the beginning of the century.
Well, the South African embassy in Kyiv says it's monitoring developments closely. It's also assisting South African nationals in the East European country. Let's discuss what's going on. We will be joined shortly by Senior Research Fellow at Africa-Asia Dialogue, Tembisa Fakuden, and also on the line, Professor Siphamanla Zondi, who is a researcher at the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation at UJ. Prof, thank you for being with us. There are some sanctions, of course, the EU talking about intensifying those, the US saying it'll slap more sanctions. But to what extent are the people without any pushback in terms of military force, to what extent are the people of Ukraine on their own?
Good afternoon. Indeed, the people on the ground will be hoping that there will be an end to conflict. And the people at the top need to understand how to end that conflict. One way of ending that conflict is to ask Russia not to proceed to their military operation. And secondly is to ask NATO to assure Russia that it will not lure Ukraine into the membership of NATO, because that is what creates conditions for this unfortunate development that we see right now. So you do need people at the top to think very carefully about how their posture could worsen the situation for people on the ground.
Professor, I think I missed you for a short while there. Are you saying that NATO should give in to Russia's demand and give an assurance that Ukraine will not join NATO now or ever?
Yes, I think that NATO should give in to Russia's demand, and Russia should give in to the UN's demand that it must pull back. So both sides must give in, because their posture on both sides creates conditions for an unfortunate development that you see now. It's long been in the making for about the last 7 years. This posture has put us where. So both sides need to assist the situation and bring peace back and let the United Nations lead the process.
All right, Tembisa, Fakuden, I did introduce you earlier. You're now with us on Zoom. What do you think about this? Because at the heart of this is Russia's demand that Ukraine not be allowed to join NATO. Should Ukraine be at the mercy of that demand by Russia, or should the world fight back despite the implications here, the terrible implications for the people of Ukraine tonight?
Well, we have to accept that you have a bully in Russia by the name of Putin, who has continued to threaten the stability of the region. Ukraine is not the only country that's been stabilized. He was involved in Belarus, if you remember, also involved in Georgia. And this standoff was unprovoked. And the reason why it was unprovoked, it was because you have a section of the Ukrainians who still look at Russia for their own political direction and cultural direction, particularly the Russian-speaking Ukrainians in places such as Luhansk and Donetsk. So this is where we find ourselves. Imagine in South Africa if one day King Mswati, notwithstanding, of course, his size and power, that he wakes up and complains about the ill treatment of the Swazi-speaking people in Outbreak, and then decides that because of that and because we share culture and language, I'm going to go into South Africa and annex Nelspruit. And this is precisely what has happened here. The international precedence that's been set is extremely dangerous, particularly for those who have this kind of separatist mentality and ambitions. We have groupings in South Africa, in Cape Town, in Orania, who have similar ambitions. And if such actions are encouraged, you are likely to have the proliferation of such political actions around the world. So they have to be stopped.
Mr. Fakuden, staying with you, Putin has called Ukraine an artificial construct carved from Russia. So he's trying to make it bigger than that, saying actually it's part of Russia. Ukrainians say their history dates back more than 1,000 years. There are some Russian-speaking, Russian-sympathetic Ukrainians, but can we just clarify, would you say the majority are actually aligned more to the democratic West?
Well, like in South Africa, we have people who speak Sesotho, we have people who speak Setswana, and we have people who speak Siswati, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all of them belong to these countries that border South Africa. What you have in Russia, yes, indeed, you have people, because of their history, by the way, Russia, Ukraine, and others used to be part of the Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union crumbled between 1989 and 1991, these national borders were recognized by the world, that they are now independent countries. So you can't continue having a person, a bully in that region who wants to resuscitate this old grand Russia. So Putin harbors the ambitions of resuscitation of the former glorious Soviet Union. And this is what we see happening. This, if it's not stopped this time around, I would like to believe that Ukraine will not be the last country that will be experiencing this continual intimidation by Putin. We have seen what it did in Belarus, for example, where the free and fair elections were tampered with because he did not like the possibility of a West-leaning leader taking over in that country. So it's a very dangerous situation and precedence. And I'm sure that countries like China are going to get emboldened moving forward because they themselves are on this expansionist program of trying to eliminate territories, particularly in places such as Taiwan, Hong Kong, Tibet. So you'll see that happening. But I think for me, the most important thing is, as South Africa, we find ourselves in a group of gangsters in BRICS, for example. I mean, is it still necessary for us to remain in that coalition, given that all the leaders that are part of that coalition at the moment are accused of violations, whether it's Modi in India, whether it's Brazil, whether it's China, and South Africa finds itself, unfortunately, in this grouping. So I think we must, we'll hope that South Africa will reconsider its position, because it's, again, not looking very good for brand South Africa to be continually associated with this group of individuals.
All right, let me put that to you, Professor, because firstly, I mean, how important or significant is it that China has resisted calling this an invasion, not necessarily standing side by side with Russia, but sitting on the fence? And what should we as South Africa do? We can't change outcomes seemingly, but should we be disassociating ourselves from Russia, China, maybe even from the BRICS, and say that was an old idea, but they don't stand for what we stand for anymore?
Yes, there are 196 countries, the member states of the UN, and there are about 16 that have called this an invasion. That gives you a context. There's over 160 countries that have not decided to take a side, one way or the other. Because if you understand the conflict in broader terms, and if you are not part of a campaign this way or that way, you would understand that it's not, there are no angels, there are no devils here. It is just the two geopolitical positioning of the two forces, NATO on the one hand, Russia on the other hand, that have brought us here. You can't solve it by merely hitting one side. It just won't help. It won't take care of it. Our traditional position as South Africa is called non-aligned. We don't align with anyone. We don't support anyone. Like the United Nations, I think the position should be Russia stop, NATO and Russia negotiate, but NATO don't provoke this thing. Don't move east. It's just create conditions until you have negotiated things. Create conditions that leads to really a serious fear. This is why it is very important that you give the dialogue, diplomacy a chance. The United Nations in the lead. Both sides need to come to the table and resolve the issues. The issues are much broader than they are usually expressed in sensational form. The issues are geopolitical, and you need to solve that at a deeper level. The United Nations has spoken, give peace a chance to both sides. They must do it. South Africa is not. South Africa has taken a position also that we should promote dialogue, and that is the best way to end the current conflict and lay the ground for a longer-term peace.
But Professor,
our agenda should not be simply to follow the NATO propaganda or the Russian propaganda. Neither propaganda is good. Both propagandas are bad.
All right, I think you two guests fundamentally disagree. So, Professor, I was going to ask you about the UN, but we're running out of time, so let me give it to Mr. Fakuden. What do you think about the UN? I mean, there's been weeks and months and dialogue to the hills, but no outcome that seemingly was in line with where all that diplomacy was going. And you have, on the Security Council, one of the main members starting a war. Mr. Fakuden, is this possibly the beginning of the end for the UN?
Well, I think once again, South Africa is embracing and taking a position that will be on the wrong side of history. You have a bully, a person who has been amassing troops outside the border of Ukraine and continually threatened to invade that country. President Macron of France and Olaf Scholz of Germany have been trying very hard to convince Putin that is not the right course of action. And as he insisted, he went on, by the way, to recognize two regions in Donbas region where separatist movements have been calling for cessation. Can you imagine what this sets in terms of precedents around the world? And South Africa should be firm and take a very serious position in this regard in terms of discouraging such bullying. We can't go ahead to have this permanent member of the UN Security Council who will do as he pleases whenever he feels like it. And I'm afraid that what we see at the moment is going to come back to haunt us as Africans, because the supply of energy, particularly oil and gas, Russia remains the third oil producer in the world and the second largest gas producer in the world. What we've seen in the past is that whenever there's this kind of standoff, smaller countries tend to redirect their energy produce into European countries because of the shortfall.
Yeah.
And that will impact on us as South Africa. But early this morning, for the first time in 7 years, the price of oil went past $100 per barrel. So I'm not quite sure whether it's something that we should be encouraging, and we should fold our hands and hope that at some point President Putin will come to his senses and resolve this problem. South Africa must put pressure. And as South African, we have to put pressure on South Africa to leave BRICS, because it has become an embarrassment to brand South Africa. And it continues to drag us into this association with the gangsters such as Putin, Xi Jinping, and Bolsonaro of Brazil.
Professor, very quickly, your response. Isn't he correct that all the diplomacy of the UN and the EU has yielded nothing?
There hasn't been serious diplomacy, by the way, because we haven't had a meeting that puts together Putin on one side and the Secretary General of NATO on the other side. There has been what you call diplomacy, which was to push one side in one direction, simply partly because the negotiators, my interlocutor indicates Macron was trying to push for solution. Macron is part of the problem. Germany is part of the problem. They are pushing for NATO to expand to the east. It creates a problem. I understand why they do. They want to win. They want to dominate the world. They want a particular version of politics to dominate the world. But you don't force it, because it creates conditions where war-like leaders, including Putin, then can take advantage and run with it. The UN is critical. The UN's position is very important, and the UN is going to save us. What is happening now is not new. The U.S. invasion of Libya was by a member of the Security Council. Yeah. But in the end, the UN position was correct in that position, and in this one too, that you need negotiated solution by both sides. There are no angels, there are no devils.
All right, you both have very different views on how South Africa should respond to this. Thank you very much. And we will look at the oil price and the economic implications as the show continues. That was Professor Siphamanla Zondi, researcher at the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation at the University of Johannesburg. Also, Tembisa Fakuden, Senior Research Fellow at Asia-Africa Dialogues.